Hi, everyone, and welcome to our talk on software provenance. Let's go ahead and jump into it. Before we get started, quickly wanted to introduce myself. I'm Matt Wyckhouse. I'm the founder and CEO of Finite State. Prior to Finite State, I spent most of my career supporting the US federal government through a company called Battelle. We worked with the defense and intelligence sector, supporting global cyber operations, a lot of work trying to understand vulnerabilities in embedded systems and our supply chains. And I founded Finite State about 3 years ago with the goal of trying to help our customers across the board understand the risks in the embedded devices that they're using, and trying to do that with a lot of technology to help automate a process that's been very tedious to do. Today, Finite State has one of the largest device intelligence databases in the world. We've analyzed hundreds of thousands of firmware, and we work across the board with device manufacturers, asset owners, users of devices, and governments and regulators. And that's enough on me and the company. And let's jump into the topic of the day, which is supply chain security. Why does everyone all of a sudden care about supply chain security so much? Well, first of all, we, as you all probably know, because you're here at this conference today, we're living in the era of connected devices, or broadly Internet of Things devices. That could be everything from OT equipment, industrial control systems, to medical devices, to consumer IoT, to enterprise IoT, phones and TVs, printers, building automation systems, you name it. We are becoming more and more dependent on these devices that are embedded devices. And we can see the trends there. It's not slowing down. We've crossed the threshold where connected embedded devices have surpassed traditional IT devices deployed globally. And most importantly, what we need to recognize is that with these devices comes a very dramatic change in risk. The cybersecurity industry historically has been looking at risk as managing the users of systems, making sure that our users don't click on phishing emails, don't install malicious software, understand what they're doing on their system. But with embedded devices, obviously, the risk is quite different. The risk primarily comes from the supply chain of that device, because the configuration of that device is relatively small. The amount that you can configure is small compared to a general purpose IT device. So most of it is effectively hard-coded in there, and that usually lives in what we would call the firmware for the device. And you can think about this difference when we look at how we provision devices. If you're working for a large enterprise and you get a new computer, you can expect that your IT department and your security department are going to take that computer for a long period of time. They're going to provision it with an operating system, software, including security software that can monitor that device from the inside. With embedded devices, we don't really have that. Generally, in an organization, an embedded device, an IoT device, is just going to be procured and plugged into the network, wired or wirelessly. Sometimes the security team knows, sometimes the IT team knows, and sometimes they don't. But when you look at what's going on inside of those devices, they are a computer just as much as every other IT device that we look at. They have a full stack of software, starting, and hardware built on the foundation of different hardware components, firmware for those devices, for those components, an operating system, third-party libraries that might come with the operating system, might come from other places, and then applications. All of that gets bundled together into that firmware image. And even the manufacturers of the devices have a hard time understanding what all of those components are and where they come from. And we know that they come from a complicated global supply chain. And the results of those complicated global supply chains are that we have a lot of security issues when it comes to embedded devices. We all know that. We're here today to talk about that. So we have examples like Urgent 11, where you have a deeply embedded vulnerability inside of a third-party IP stack inside the operating system that affects millions of devices. Ripple 20 was very similar to that. We have examples across the board of accusations of backdoors in different equipment. Most of the time, that is some sort of hard-coded credential that was left there. We have targeted attacks from sophisticated actor groups. For example, the Dragonfly group has been targeting the US energy sector for about a decade and trying different types of supply chain attacks to get in there for the purposes of gaining access to different utility networks so that they can execute future operations. And we have a lot that's been happening in the news related to government response to these issues. Probably the most notable example is the Huawei or ZTE ban in the US and in other countries, including the UK. So before we dive into those issues, let's talk about supply chain security a little bit deeper. So what is a supply chain? Well, when you buy a product, probably lately that's a product that you purchase on something like Amazon. That product is built, it's manufactured in a factory, it goes through some sort of logistics and transportation supply chain, it winds up at a retailer, and then it gets delivered again until when it reaches your home. With software also has a supply chain, although it's different. You have third-party sources that could be open source or closed source. You have build systems, you have a network that you're using to combine all of this. That goes into an application repository, and then it goes to your deployed systems. And those are managed. But with an embedded device, you get to experience both of these things. You have software and dependencies. You also have this new thing that we like to call configuration, where the configuration of the operating system becomes part of the firmware image. You have build systems and packaging, and you get these firmware images that live on some sort of an image repository or update server and get pushed to devices that go through a physical supply chain now. So we can take all of that together and we can say, what is the attack surface for an embedded device or connected device supply chain? And as you can see here, it's pretty large. There are opportunities all over the place for an attacker to compromise things. It could be as obvious as first-party software that's designed to beacon out and collect data and send it to a server on the right-hand side. It could be as subtle as an actor group intentionally compromising a GitHub repository of a popular open source library that gets later incorporated into devices and gives them access to future networks. These compromises could be in the physical supply chain, such as physical interdictions. It could be a software supply chain attack, including upstream compromises or malicious insiders who are writing software. It could be a hardware supply chain attack. I know that those are really sexy and tend to make the news when we have a suspected one, but they are notoriously hard to pin down true examples of this. Or it could be something that happens after the fact, post-deployment, like the compromise of an update server, like a lot of the watering hole attacks that we hear about. Now let's look at the US perspective though. This attack surface is pretty complicated, and there's a lot of technical details, and some of these things can be hard to detect. So we can just simplify this and work with me here for a minute. We can simplify this and say, let's just call everything that we went through supply chain risk. And then rather than focusing on those technical aspects that are hard, let's talk about the actors who could target the supply chain. And when we're talking about threats and actors, we're talking about intent, capability, and opportunity. And unsurprisingly, when you are looking at it from a US perspective, the usual suspects of Iran, China, and Russia emerge. Each of these have some combination of intent, capability, and opportunity from a supply chain standpoint. So the theory would be that we can solve this problem if we take those adversaries, those actors who have the intent, capability, and opportunity, and we just prevent them from supplying us with critical equipment. So if we know who's going to target us, the solution should be easy enough to implement by just preventing them from supplying us. Well, it turns out that legally, it actually is pretty easy to do this. And the most recent administration in the US has taken several steps to do this. There have been multiple executive orders and several laws and changes in procurement for government agencies that are all designed to prevent adversary countries from supplying our critical infrastructure. And on their surface, these are well-reasoned, understandable steps when you have complicated threats and you have real supply chain attacks that have happened and a country's trying to safeguard their infrastructure. And for example, we have multiple executive orders. A few are targeting telco. Some are actually targeting trying to prevent the purchase of foreign produced equipment from adversary countries landing in the power grid. So legally, we can do this. Now let's try to qualify this in a few different cases. So we're going to look at this methodology and try to apply it to a few companies. Let's start with the most popular one. And again, I want to be clear. We're not talking about any particular companies here with the intent to disparage them. I just wanted to use a few real world examples to kind of walk through how complicated some of these issues can be. So Huawei is arguably a very complicated issue, and it varies from country to country what each country is willing to do from a national security standpoint when it comes to deploying Huawei kit in their 5G networks. So the question we can ask is, under the framework that the US government is using, is Huawei okay to use? The answer is quite simply no, it's not. Whether you individually trust them or not, it doesn't matter. The decision has been made legally. And if you did want to know how to assess the risk of Huawei devices, Finite State did put a report out a little over a year ago that quantifies the risk inside of a lot of their products. So this one is pretty straightforward from the criteria that have already been established. Well, let's look at another one. And I know Leo from Siemens is here again, not meant to disparage whatsoever. But let's look at the complications of trying to apply this methodology to other companies besides Huawei. So Siemens is a global multinational corporation. They're headquartered in the EU, one of the largest suppliers of OT equipment. Our power grid would not run in the US or in most countries without Siemens. But Siemens has 21 R&D hubs and 5,000 R&D and engineering staff located in China, supporting them as a company, as many multinational companies do. So what do we do about that? And then we can take the case of Honeywell. This is a US-based company. They've been a US-based company for over a century, supplying critical infrastructure, defense, intelligence, with critical equipment. In general, you could look at their products and say that they're quite secure. However, Honeywell had some issues with their cameras. For a long time, they were just white labeled Dahua cameras that used Huawei chips from the HiSilicon brand inside of them. And so as a blanket statement, you couldn't necessarily say Honeywell is okay under this framework. And so we can go back to our supply chain and look at where each of these fits. And you can see that there are different places in the supply chain for each of these issues. Huawei is all the way on the right with their label on the product. Siemens has software engineers in China, which is one of the countries we said was a potential threat to the US. That's probably contributing to a lot of their devices. And Honeywell has components on the hardware side and software side that were also coming out of this potential adversary country. So what do? We can try to draw some lines here. So we can go back, take a step back and say, let's look at that attack surface again. Let's look at these different potential issues and let's try to draw some lines on what we want to prevent from a provenance standpoint. Well, we can start here and we can say only US-based manufacturers are allowed in. And if we look at a particular device and we draw the line right here, you're likely only going to have one vendor that you have to assess. And that would work for Huawei, but as we talked about with Honeywell, you would miss there. So we need to widen our search a little bit and draw a line further back. Okay, so now we can say anything with hardware components coming from an adversary country cannot be procured for critical networks. Okay, that would catch the Honeywell situation that we just described. But it wouldn't deal with Siemens that we talked about. So then if we wanted to deal with Siemens, we would need to say all of the software would need to be made only by US citizens. And when we look at this and we look at a single device, now we're probably talking about software that comes from hundreds of vendors. And if we go one step further and we want to deal with open source, now we're talking about thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of developers. And it seems as though it's very difficult to draw a line that we can stand behind. And probably most importantly, if we just take this provenance approach, you might think that drawing those lines is going to protect us from these attacks, but the reality is they won't. Deciding security based on country of origin is unlikely to solve the problems that we have up here. If just because a company is located in a certain adversary country doesn't mean that's the only way for that adversary country to find a way into the supply chain. They can find ways into supply chains in a lot of other places. So this is probably a losing proposition. What can we actually do? Well, we can reorganize our model. We can reorganize our criteria based upon risk. So let's start with what we want to prevent. We don't want adversary intelligence services or criminal groups to be able to exploit vulnerabilities in the supply chain or co-opt companies into helping them do that. And in particular, we care about three classes of things. We care about embedded threats, as in the device when you get it already has the potential for compromise in it. It's designed to communicate something back. We have vulnerabilities, which maybe someone else in the supply chain already knows about and can use for future access. Or we have the potential that even though we have a completely clean device, in the future, someone could compromise it because they have some means of accessing or changing that device. And so that's where we talk about things like future firmware updates and watering hole attacks and service providers where you have a vendor you might not trust whose personnel need to come into your organization. The good news about all of this, even though there's a lot here, is that what we're really talking about is detecting threats and vulnerabilities. And the good news is we can detect those, and then we can take a risk-based approach to this problem. So we need to look at this on a product-by-product basis, and we need to think about it through the lens of risk. Well, where else have we thought about solving risk-based problems like this? We like to use the analogy of an airport. So you have to have a risk-based approach that incorporates several different tactics. You've got to check the IDs, which are your third-party vendor risk assessments and access management. You want to make sure you know who you're buying from and you know when they're accessing the devices on your network, and you understand that. On the far left, you have penetration testing of devices. This is going to help you understand the security of the device very deeply, but it's not very scalable. It's kind of like when you get taken back into the other room for secondary screening at an airport. You can't do that to every passenger, but doing it at random and periodically does help improve your security. In the middle here is what we call firmware and software verification and analysis. This is a screening system designed to look at each firmware image or software image as it comes into your network and help you automatically assess the risk. This is a scalable solution to this problem that doesn't just rely upon trust. It doesn't just rely upon the provenance of the device to make an assessment. We actually can look at the risk. And so what we can do is for each firmware that we acquire, we can take it, we can unpack it, and we can look at it. We can ask the vendor to support this as well. And we can say, what's going on in this device? We can say, show me the vulnerabilities, show me the software bill of materials, what sort of threats do we know are embedded inside of this device by looking at IOCs that can be correlated to files inside of the firmware? What about the credentials and access controls? We can look at all of that by analyzing the firmware. And furthermore, even though we've talked about hardware threats, the reality is most threats live in the software and firmware, not in the hardware. And even if there is something embedded in the hardware, it almost always requires something in the software to cooperate with to make that an effective capability. And so we can scalably look at this. We can look at each aspect of the firmware, we can scan it, and we can map it to a risk model. And this risk model includes vulnerabilities, it includes threats, it includes an understanding of the software bill of materials and the hardware bill of materials, it includes understanding access management. And most importantly, we're not ignoring geopolitical and legal risk. It is important to understand the provenance of your devices, and it is important to factor that into your risk calculus. For example, the US Department of Defense probably isn't okay with an adversary software vendor in some of their really critical systems, and that's okay. Just likewise, China's probably not okay with US-based software vendors in their critical weapon systems. That's part of the risk analysis they would do on a device-by-device basis, and that all needs to be factored in. So how do we look at that? Well, again, we can look at this model, and we can look at the provenance. We can say what vendors were in the supply chain for this device, and you can detect that by analyzing the software. You can say where are they located. You can look at foreign ownership, control, and influence. You can look at geopolitical risks. For example, if you're a US-based company, you probably want to understand that China has a national intelligence law that can compel companies to provide information to the intelligence services. That's part of the geopolitical risk landscape. You can like it or not, it's just one of the risk factors that you need to consider. You also need to look at overall what's going on in that firmware and software. What software components are there? Are there components that I'm particularly concerned about as a user? What sort of credentials are baked into that device, and what sort of future access management can that facilitate? Are there things that look like backdoors? What about cryptographic issues and OS configuration issues? We can look at all of that, we can detect it. And threats and vulnerabilities, do we know that this device has been targeted by specific actor groups? Are there vulnerabilities that have been reported against this device or the software inside of it? All of this is really important information for your security team, and it's all sitting in the firmware if you just look. And so, all in all, we believe that the best approach is to incorporate device risk analysis into the overall security lifecycle for a device. We call this device SecOps. And so it goes all the way through the lifecycle from procurement to update to deployment to operations and monitoring of a device when you're using it. At each stage, you can proactively manage your risk, and you can work with your vendors to provide your organization with a more secure deployment of your connected devices. And we can walk through this stage by stage. At procurement time, you need to be assessing your vendor's risk. You need to do those third-party risk assessments, but you also need to assess the product risk. And you can do that at the time of purchase by looking at the firmware. When you update a device, it is very important to recognize that no matter what anyone says, a firmware update can completely change the functionality of a device, including weakening its security. We've seen this in numerous cases where a firmware update actually weakens the security of the device. It's very counterintuitive. It's very important that every time you get an update, you check it. And you can do that again by analyzing the firmware or software. Checking the authenticity prevents watering hole attacks. You want to make sure that the hash of the file or the certificate or signature that's associated with that particular update matches what the vendor intended to send you. There's a lot of different tools that you can use to verify this. When you deploy, you should know what the risks are in this device, and you should know how to mitigate them by secure device configuration guidance. You can use pen testing periodically, like we talked about. During the operations phase, it's really important to know what you have on your network through asset inventory. You should be managing your access to those devices and logging that. Continuous vulnerability analysis can come out of this firmware analysis capability. You need to look at patches and prioritize those and make sure you're applying the most important ones from a security standpoint. And then from a monitoring standpoint, you should be attempting to detect threats with network security tools. And you can correlate that information to all of the data that you extract during your firmware analysis. And most importantly, again, you need to work together with your vendors to tackle these issues. Supply chain security is not an individual problem. It is a problem that only can be solved through increased transparency and collaboration and communication. And with that, I'll take any questions. You can, and if there are questions in the future, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me through LinkedIn or Twitter, or through the Finite State website. Thank you all for your time today, and I look forward to diving into some questions in our next session.